Hello, everybody. Let's,
Yes, let's do that.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 4 of Let's Talk About Sweat.
So are you gonna
How about I'll just do the whole thing. I'll just do the whole thing. I'll
introduce.
Yeah. Because I didn't know if we want to both say hi. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 4 of Let's Talk About Sweat. This week, we're talking about the history of antiperspirants. It's just David and me this week, but it is a fascinating history, and I think y'all can learn something. That sounded patronizing.
I am your teacher.
This week, David and I are talking about the history of antiperspirants. We learned a lot doing this, so I hope you enjoy listening to it. But before that, David, you want to tell us this week's embarrassing sweat story?
Yeah, so this week's embarrassing sweat story is another one of mine, actually. It's something that every hand sweater knows and has done before. It doesn't sound that embarrassing, but if you've been there, if you've done it, you know exactly what I'm talking about and you can relate. So I was interviewing for different scholarships senior year of high school. This one in particular was at Georgia Tech. I'm from Atlanta. I'm from Decatur. It's about 20 minutes north of the city, but Georgia Tech in Atlanta. And was interviewing. It was like this, final interview weekend. We go for in-person interviews. There are like 60 of us. And we go into, each one of us has an individual interview with like 6 people in a room. And it was an hour-long interview. At the end, after I shake everyone's hands, I'm like, my hand is so wet and dripping. I try to tell them, sorry, I just washed my hands. That's why it's wet. And then my face gets beet red because I've been in the room for an hour and have not used the restroom in over 3. So that was pretty obvious to people, and they gave me some really weird looks because obviously I had not left the room to go to the bathroom, and they knew that. And that was just one of many times I've had to try to make up an excuse for why my hands are so sweaty and have failed to do so.
Well, I think a lot of us have had experiences like that. If you want to share yours, send it to mystory@mycarpe.com. We'd love to feature you on the show. But without further ado, let's talk about sweat.
Let's talk about sweat.
Hey everybody, I'm Kasper.
And I'm David, and we were 2 sweaty guys who started Carpe.
We met in college, we connected over our sweaty hands, and we've spent the past few years thinking about sweat, researching sweat, and working on sweat solutions.
So join us each week, and let's talk about sweat.
All right, welcome back everybody. Last week we were talking with Andrew Best, who was teaching us a lot about how sweating evolved. This week we're talking about something a bit different, kind of cutting much closer to the present day. We want to talk about how our solutions to sweat have sort of evolved recently, basically how antiperspirants came into existence.
Yeah, and we're excited to dive in. So this is slightly a different style. I don't know most of the answers here, and so I'm just going to be asking questions, and Kasper's been doing a lot of the research into the actual history. So for me, the first question that I have about the history of antiperspirants is, when was the first one ever made?
Yeah, just for some context, it was around 1900, right? So it's actually only been about 100 years that we've had antiperspirants. But, backing it up before that, people still got sweaty, people still were smelly, and it's not like it wasn't a problem. Like, people had solutions for this, but you have to remember that, as far back or as recently as 200 years ago, in like castles, people were pooping behind curtains and wearing napkins, perfume napkins to not smell it. I don't know. That's not part of the research that I did in depth, but that's something I remember from touring castles in Europe way back when. Do you remember that?
No,
that's not a thing, No, this is a thing. Like I look it up. Like a few hundred years ago, people in castles, they had like these basically rooms where they would just go in and poop, and it would just accumulate there. So I think we had like a...
So back to sweat.
Well, we had the point is we had a lower standard of personal hygiene coming into this, right? And then late in the 19th century, so like in the 1880s, was the first recorded instance of a deodorant coming onto the market. And the reason odor...
Actually onto the market.
Actually onto the market, yeah. Okay. I'm sure like, some alchemists in the 1600s had probably tried something, but, never to leave the confines of their lab. But the reason that we started with odor, I think, is because people were apparently already using these like sweat shields under their clothes. So, you can still get these today, but basically cotton pads that you put under your arms, that they kind of stick on so you don't see the sweating on your clothes. This is something that a lot of people were actively using day to day in Victorian times, basically like late 1800s.
Okay, so they were using these cotton sweat shields into the late 1800s, and then we had, before antiperspirants, we had the onset of the deodorant. And how did the deodorant come about?
So the deodorant, so that's just like kind of a one-off. It was called
Okay.
Mum, I think. It was like 1880. I didn't actually write it down in my notes, but basically, just an attempt to start doing something about the odor, but it wasn't super popular, right?
What was it? Do we know?
It was just some kind of, it was some slight antimicrobial agent.
Okay.
Basically, one of the ways deodorants can work is by trying to attack the bacteria that grow that actually cause the odor. I don't remember if we talked about this in the first episode, right? But, the reason armpits get smelly is because the apical glands release, pretty dense sweat that's laden with a lot of organic materials. That's really good for bacteria to grow in. And then the eccrine sweat glands really add a ton of moisture. So that kind of soup is great for bacteria. They make it smelly. So, stop the bacteria. Theoretically, you can stop the smell. But the deodorant didn't work that well. The cotton sweat shields were still pretty nasty. And so in 1903, this is funny because there's actually not a very good record of this, but there's all sorts of little references showing that in 1903 there was some uncommon antiperspirant called Everdry that made it onto the market, and it was just like a liquid, and you were supposed to dab it on with a cotton pad. And
Do we know what it actually was?
aluminum chloride, almost certainly.
okay.
Yeah. And then so there's like this brief mention of Everdry in 1903, but it doesn't seem to go anywhere. And then in 1909. This is when it really got started. So this surgeon in Cincinnati, Dr. Abraham D. Murphy of Cincinnati, Ohio, basically had sweaty hands when he was, in surgery, and he wanted to do something about this. And I couldn't get a clear answer on what made him think to use aluminum chloride, but apparently it was maybe a cleaning agent used at the time, and he noticed that it was like stopping his sweaty hands. So he started putting aluminum chloride on his hands, and that really reduced the hand sweating during surgery.
Wow. So he discovered that aluminum chloride helped reduce sweating just as like a side effect of using it for something else.
I think so. There's no clear record of that, but that's what it seems like because it really wasn't being used widely as an antiperspirant. I mean, I would say 99% of people didn't have the concept of an antiperspirant in their minds at the time, right?
Okay, so he discovers that aluminum chloride, what concentrate was it?
So this is funny. So they, I think the company wasn't really publishing this, but they did some studies on it. Some independent labs did some studies on it in like the 1910s. And basically turned out it was 33% aluminum chloride.
Wow.
Yeah, and so for context, Drysol today, which is like the really irritating prescription aluminum chloride, is what, 25%?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this stuff is insanely irritating because aluminum chloride forms hydrochloric acid, and I think we talked about this a bit in our first episode. But yeah, so it's super irritating. But he's using it on his hands. He's using it on his hands where the skin isn't that thick. He's using it on his hands where the skin's thick enough that I think the irritation's manageable. But his daughter, Edna Grace Murphy, put it on her armpits and she said, "Oh wow, this stops the sweat. This stops the odor." For whatever reason, she tolerated the irritation, but she said this could be big. So she tried to start selling it under the brand name Odorono, which is like odor. Oh no. Odorono.
Wow, it's amazing.
Yeah.
So when did she try to start selling it?
1910.
So she tried to start selling it in 1910, and did it go anywhere?
No, not at all. So 1910, Cincinnati, Ohio. This is really the roots, I think, of modern antiperspirants. She starts selling it, on consignment in some local pharmacies, and the inventory just isn't moving. And she's got a couple people doing door-to-door sales, which is keeping it afloat. But for the first 2 years, she really didn't get any traction. She was 23 when she started this, by the way. 1910, wow. She was 23. Yeah.
And was she trying to sell it as a hand antiperspirant, like her father used it for, or as an underarm?
So primarily underarm, because I was looking at ads from like the early 1910s when this company was really getting started. They were running newspaper ads, and the vast majority of them were saying that basically these underarm sweat shields are deprecated. You no longer need underarm sweat shields because you now have something that will actually stop the sweat. But I also found an ad for golfers in 1917 from Odorono where they were said, it was this testimonial from a golfer who was saying like his game is so much better because his hands don't sweat when he puts Odorono on them.
That's amazing. So what ended up happening with the company?
So, really tough start, but in 1912, she kept it at this exhibition in Atlantic City all summer. And that's when it really started taking off. It was like a hot summer in Atlantic City. More and more people started trying it. And it was red and stained clothes, and it was aluminum chloride at 33%. So it was super irritating. But it was the first real solution to excessive sweating in the armpits. So it really, really started slowly taking off from there. It really took off over the next 2 decades. And some other competitors started entering the market. But that was really the start of this brand. And then in 1928, it took them that long to release a less irritating version.
Oh, wow.
So that was the beginning.
What was the less irritating version?
I'm not sure. Okay. I think it was just less aluminum chloride. But in 1933, she sold the company for $3.5 million, which in today money is like, I don't know, like 60-ish. So yeah, so she started this from nothing at 23, this thing her dad had made to stop sweaty hands in the OR, and grew it into the first prominent antiperspirant brand.
Wow. Who'd she sell it to?
So she sold it to this company named Northam Warren. They started growing it into all sorts of SKUs, all sorts of different antiperspirant products, and they sold it in 1960. And by 1987, it was owned by Unilever. So, just a series of acquisitions. And Unilever rolled it up into the trademark Rexona, which is...
Oh, wow, that's Degree.
That's Degree. So that's the most popular antiperspirant in the world today. And, it was kind of a merger of a few different brands they had. But basically, Odorono has slowly evolved into what most of us know as Degree today. Yeah.
That's really insane. So
1909.
So it took almost a century for the antiperspirant market to really take hold?
Well, about half a century, actually. So
you said Unilever bought it in like 1980.
Yeah, but at that point it was, there were so many brands out there. That's just like a curiosity that, this first antiperspirant brand has kind of become Degree.
Okay, great. So she sells Odorono in 1930-ish.
Yes.
And what does she do after that? Do we know?
Oh, she's done. She's out of the story.
All right.
She worked on other like cosmetics brands.
Perfect. When did like antiperspirants first? Why are they called antiperspirants? Who called them antiperspirants and deodorants?
I don't know. I spent a few days doing research on this. We'll talk to a historian about this in a future episode, but that is not one of the facts.
Okay, so we don't know the etymology.
No, we don't know the etymology of the word.
When did antiperspirants really become mainstream in terms of like they're sold in every store? There are a ton of competing brands, and there are also a set of regulations around them. Like, what is the entire landscape, and how did the landscape around them evolve? And because now we have 15, 20 different aluminum salts outside of just aluminum chloride. How did we get to that point?
That's a great question. So it seems like kind of through the 20s is when Odorono really started growing into a household name. But it started with women. So the advertising really, really targeted women who were using these sweat shields under their dresses. And you look back at these ads and it's basically like, stop ruining your dresses. It's like, or a careless mistake of forgetting your sweat shield, costs you this dress forever. And Odorono could have prevented that. And guys were very resistant to using this for a while.
Why?
Well, because it was considered like manly to smell bad.
Oh my God.
Apparently. Yeah. Jeez. The marketing companies were publishing research about this in the early 20th century, and it was like, I don't know what we're gonna do. Guys like smelling bad. This one guy said he sometimes rubs his body down in grain alcohol after showering to prevent the smell. So that's like a manly way, apparently to deal with it. Which, funny enough, he was kind of onto something there, because complete sidebar, in the clinical trials for Qbrexza, if you look at their vehicle, which is largely an alcohol vehicle, it actually did do pretty well in reducing sweat in and of itself. So like maybe there's something there. But anyway, guys eventually came around to it. I know that right after World War II, like around World War II, there was this company right after World War II that was actually selling antiperspirants, or it might have been a deodorant, in like whiskey jugs, because the founder was like, there's nothing more manly than whiskey. So that's how we're going to get guys.
So the antiperspirant was just still a liquid at that point.
Yeah, it was largely liquids for a pretty long time. Odorono did some really interesting innovation in like the 30s and 40s and started doing powder antiperspirants. They did get into deodorants as well a little bit. But really, it seems like in the 50s was when it went from or something that most people knew about, but a few people were using, to something that every single person was using. Because by the 70s, it seems like 98% of people in the United States were using this daily. But I think one of the things that helped that happen is in basically the 40s. Yeah, here we go. In the 40s, people really started looking into ways to make antiperspirants less irritating and more usable. So like the first patent that I can find is in 1940. That's basically a method to try to make aluminum chloride less irritating. And then in 1947, two chemists, this guy named Goret and this guy named de Nevers, were experimenting with basic aluminum chloride. So they were trying to replace most of the chloride with hydroxide ions. If you know what chlorohydrate is, that's like chloride with hydroxide-ish, basically. So this is when the chlorohydrates developed. I don't know, listeners, how familiar you are with the aluminum salts, but basically these days, 99% of antiperspirants out there use aluminum chlorohydrate or some variant thereof. So 1947, that's when these aluminum chlorohydrate salts entered the market, and they're not quite as effective, but they still stop sweat and they're not irritating. And that's the big thing, because aluminum chloride forms this hydrochloric acid, aluminum chlorohydrate does not. And from there, the innovation really exploded over the next couple decades. And actually, most of the modern antiperspirant salts we have today were invented between the 40s and the 60s.
And who was inventing them?
I think it was labs, research labs for these manufacturers, for companies like Unilever. But then spray deodorants, spray...
aerosols.
Aerosol antiperspirants, sorry. Wow, I'm making the antiperspirant deodorant mistake. Aerosol antiperspirants became by far the most popular thing. This is what like everybody in the United States was using in the early 70s. And that is the first time that the FDA actually started talking about regulating antiperspirants. Because prior to that, they were an unregulated category, basically a cosmetic. And this is when the FDA started over-the-counter drug monograph review, like the monograph creation process. And early on in this process, I don't know if it spurred this or if this kind of happened while it was getting started, but Gillette was running some trials on spray antiperspirants in their labs, like pre-market trials, and they found that it was causing some lung stuff in mice, I think. And so suddenly all these people and it was specifically the aluminum zirconiums, I think. All these people who were using these spray antiperspirants, which, you can inhale basically, started getting worried about, what could happen here. And the FDA actually said we should stop selling spray antiperspirants until we figure out whether this causes lung damage. So long story short, they did a lot of studies and it turns out it doesn't. It doesn't seem to cause lung damage. So right now they're allowed. Like spray antiperspirants.
So did they stop for a time?
They actually did stop.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they actually stopped for a period in the 70s. And then dragged it out through this whole monograph process. And then what came out the other end, which is this over-the-counter antiperspirant monograph, really seemed to be the kind of stilling of the entire market. Because since then, there really hasn't been any innovation in form factor or in novel molecules. And that's kind of where, we decided this is where and what antiperspirants are. And now we're just going to make different sense of them, and that's kind of it. So from the 1900s, 1909, when it really got started, through 1970, and that's when innovation kind of slowed down. But at that point, everybody was using them. That's kind of when the market matured.
So if so many people are dissatisfied with their current antiperspirant deodorant product, which most people are, just because they don't work that well, the mass kind of brands on the market for heavy sweaters, why is the innovation slowed down?
Well, it's a good question. I think basically, I think what it is it's good enough for most people, or for a lot of people. It's good enough that the big companies figured there's not much sense in making this better. We started Carpe because we disagree, because we think there are ways to make it better, and we think we have made, the state of antiperspirants better. But, really, I also do think that perhaps in terms of this novel molecule innovation, some people have tried, but maybe the aluminum sesquichlorohydrates, the aluminum zirconiums are just about as effective as you can get without causing severe irritation. In terms of the novel active molecules, some of the stuff that we're doing at Carpe is increasing irritation through other ingredients in the formula, right?
Increasing efficacy.
What, did I say irritation? Yes. We are not increasing irritation. We are increasing efficacy.
We want it to burn.
No. We don't want aluminum chloride to burn. And actually, there are ways to mitigate the irritation of aluminum chloride. So that was what some of the research started in the 1940s. And, you look at the literature from like the 90s and the early 2000s, and it's actually a lot of dermatologists that are experimenting with ways to make aluminum chloride less irritating. So it's weird. It's not like people stopped trying to make antiperspirants better. It's just that the big companies stopped, probably because there didn't seem to be much of a commercial incentive to do that.
And you said that innovation really slowed down after this. When did the zirconiums pop up?
I think the zirconiums popped up in around the 50s, 60s.
Really? Okay, yeah. So we haven't had any real new molecules introduced across the aluminum salt spectrum after the 70s.
Yeah, nothing that, works on this antiperspirant mechanism of actually, getting a physical block in the sweat gland, which is kind of the least invasive way you can reduce sweat, because all the stuff that has, I guess, been innovated since has been more on the neural level. So Botox, which, kind of shuts down the neural activity of the sweat glands. Same thing with anticholinergic drugs. The biggest innovation probably in sweating in the last 5 years has been topical anticholinergics, which, a bit more of an intense mechanism of action than these antiperspirants. Right. So really not a lot of innovation in antiperspirants since the 70s, which is ironic because the 70s is the first time we really actually started figuring out that how they might work. Like they knew that they do work prior to that.
Right, because the surgeon had no idea why it worked.
Exactly.
And so what do we know now?
Well, I think, in the 50s, 60s, you start seeing papers that are exploring how it works, where it's, at that point, it's still a theory whether this just gets into the sweat gland and causes like a plug in the sweat gland, or whether it's actually getting under the skin and somehow, I guess neurologically, pharmacologically reducing the activity of the sweat glands. And some studies started showing that no, it's probably a block in the sweat gland. And 1975 was the first paper that I could find anybody citing that somebody proposed that maybe it's not just the antiperspirant itself getting in the sweat gland and suddenly forming a plug. Maybe it's interacting with something there. Maybe it's interacting with like proteins or these keratin fibers that are already in the sweat gland. And that theory was still not considered, by any means certain for decades after that. It's honestly only in the last 10 years that I've seen papers that start using electron microscopes and much more intensive techniques to confirm that, hey, that's actually probably what's happening. Is like these aluminum salts are interacting with proteins that are already in the sweat gland, and that's what's causing these blocks, these like little plugs that reduce the sweating.
Wow. What took people so long to figure out how they actually work if so many people were using them?
I think it's because it's so much simpler and so much less medical of a mechanism than most kind of over-the-counter drugs. Because most things you're using, Tylenol, Advil, what are other over-the-counter drugs, and antihistamines, allergy medications, like these are all pharmacological agents that interact in kind of complicated ways with really long chains of stuff that's happening inside your body. They're interfering with like pain transmission. They're interfering with, immune response by targeting specific things. And antiperspirants, meanwhile, are literally just making a very, very small like plug, and they just plug themselves into that sweat gland and plug the sweat gland. It's just so simple.
There are no like systemic effects.
Exactly. I think people were looking for something on that kind of biomolecular level, and it's so much more simple and so much more mechanical than that. And I think that was almost surprising.
That makes sense. So based on where we've been, where we are today, where do you think the antiperspirant category is going? I mean, over time, we've moved back. Like so based on the history, it really started in deodorants.
Yeah.
And then antiperspirants for a very long time. But now there's a shift back to, a very heavy deodorant aisle.
True. This is actually another thing that I discovered in looking into this. I think as recently as the 90s, the vast majority of people were using antiperspirants, actually. And recently, I think a lot of marketing by a lot of startups over the last 10 years that just make deodorants, because there's a lot of reasons it's kind of easier to go into the deodorant category, but it's a cosmetic, it's less regulated, I think has been moving a lot of people into deodorants. And what a lot of people are finding is that, they actually need the sweat stopped. So I think there's kind of going to be a pendulum swing back into antiperspirants. And maybe with this renewed interest, there's going to be more innovation in actual molecules, in the actual novel molecules that stop the sweat. Because I think coming into Carpe, we were thinking, okay, this is the state of the art. These are the molecules that actually stop sweating, the antiperspirant salts that actually work. And realizing that these were only discovered really as antiperspirants about 100 years ago. And the innovation only really stopped 50 years ago, and it stopped largely for what looked like commercial reasons and not actually reasons of like, we just maxed out the science. I think there's a chance that over the next couple decades, we might see even more effective antiperspirants, like from the things Carpe is doing in terms of working with working with ingredients beyond the active ingredient, beyond the antiperspirant salt to make the antiperspirants more effective, but also perhaps innovation in the actual antiperspirant salt.
That'd be awesome. I know a lot of our listeners would love that too.
Yeah, I think so. So it's an exciting. I mean, I think the big takeaway is this is way younger of a field than I think a lot of us assume, in terms of we think it's kind of what's out there. It's stuck. It's static. That's antiperspirants. That's deodorants. They're not changing. It's pretty young, and it's still changing, and it's still growing. And I think there's a lot of hope for things getting even better in the future.
So my last big question that I want to leave off on is how antiperspirant started as a solution for sweaty hands for a surgeon and became a underarm dominated market over the following decades. Why did the hand antiperspirant not catch on if that's the original need it was solving?
I think for the same reason that the innovation sort of stopped in the 70s, and that's because the world we used to live in terms of companies making products and getting them to consumers, it used to be much harder to do that. So with supply chains, with you needed to actually get your product into a store, e-commerce didn't exist. The companies that succeeded were the biggest ones, and the companies that succeeded went after the biggest markets, and that resulted in neglecting a lot of smaller needs. So, I mean, realistically, for the vast majority of people, underarm antiperspirants is what they were interested in, and I think the big companies went after that, and they just doubled down on that, and they kind of ignored everything else. And for people like us, for a lot of people with hyperhidrosis, sweaty hands are a bigger problem. Sweaty feet are a bigger problem. And I honestly think it's thanks to e-commerce, thanks to the internet, thanks to smaller companies like Carpe being able to actually get out there and get solutions, antiperspirant solutions to people who need them. Now we're starting to see better treatments slowly emerging for people with excessive sweating beyond just the armpits.
Awesome.
Cool. Well, that has been an abbreviated history of antiperspirants. If this is something that y'all found interesting, definitely reach out. You can just contact us at mystory@mycarpe.com. I know that's the email for the embarrassing sweat stories, but you can reach out to the podcast via that email about anything. And if this is something you want to hear more about, we can definitely find some historians to interview, find some people who are maybe doing some of this research in the 70s. I'm sure those folks are still around and would love to hear what it was like back then. So reach out if you're interested about hearing more. But next week, we will be back with something else, and we will talk about sweat. Is that how we want to end it?
I don't know. How do you want to end it?
See you guys next week.
Have a great week.